Where does humanity end and something else begin? Most people don't even want to ask that question. Ilya Ivanov did, and he didn't stop at asking. He wanted proof that there was no sacred line between humans and animals, no mystery, no soul, just biology, just cells, just a technical problem waiting to be solved. So he set out to do something that sounded less like science and more like a crime against nature. He wanted to create a hybrid, a human and an ape. And for a moment, the world was willing to let him try. Ivanov wasn't a madman shouting from the edge of society. He was respected, celebrated, useful. He became famous for improving artificial insemination in animals. His work changed agriculture. One stallion could father hundreds of offspring. That made him valuable, important, the kind of scientist governments listened to. But Ivanov wasn't satisfied with breeding horses and livestock. He was obsessed with something bigger, the line between species, what separated one form of life from another, and whether that line could be crossed. In 1910, he said it openly. He claimed that creating a human-ape hybrid was technically possible. At the time, most people treated it like a bizarre theory, an ugly thought from an overconfident scientist. What they didn't know was that he wasn't talking hypothetically. He was already thinking about how to do it. Then history gave him exactly the kind of system that could turn obsession into policy. The Russian Empire collapsed. The Bolsheviks took power. Religion was being torn down. The old world was being replaced by a new one built on science, materialism, and power. And Ivanov came to them with a perfect weapon. If he could create a hybrid, he wouldn't just make history. He would attack the very idea that humans were special, that there was something sacred about human life, something separate, something above animals. For the Soviet state, this wasn't just biology, it was ideology. If Ivanov succeeded, it would be more than an experiment. It would be a statement, a brutal one. That man was not made in the image of God, just another animal. So they funded him. They gave him money, permission, support. And Ivanov went to Africa. He traveled to French Guinea, where chimpanzees could actually be captured and studied. Even getting there was a sign of how seriously he was taken. Western scientific institutions helped him. He wasn't being treated like a monster. He was being treated like a pioneer. That should tell you something. People don't always recognize madness when it arrives wearing authority. In Africa, Ivanov began collecting chimpanzees. That alone was dangerous. Adult chimpanzees are powerful, aggressive, and unpredictable. But capturing them was only the beginning. Because once he had them, he moved to the part that turned theory into horror. His first plan was to inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm. If one became pregnant, he believed it would prove that the distance between humans and apes was smaller than people wanted to admit. In 1927, he tried it. He used 3 female chimpanzees, and then he waited, watched, measured, recorded. He believed it would work. It didn't. None of them became pregnant. For most people, that would have been the end. For Ivanov, it was just a failed direction. So he turned the experiment around. If human sperm wouldn't work in an ape, maybe ape sperm could work in a human woman. And this is where the story stops being disturbing in a scientific way and becomes morally rotten. While still in Africa, Ivanov considered performing the procedure on local women without their knowledge. Not with consent, not openly, secretly, under the cover of medical treatment. That tells you everything about where his mind had gone. By then, people were no longer people to him, just biological material, just possible vessels. Fortunately, that plan was blocked. French authorities refused to allow it. So Ivanov returned to the Soviet Union. And somehow, instead of being shut down, he got another chance. Back in the Soviet Union, Ivanov tried again. This time, he planned to continue on Soviet soil. And somehow, a woman came forward. In surviving records, she is known only by an initial. She wrote to Ivanov and offered herself for the experiment. She said her life had no meaning, that she wanted to dedicate herself to science. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just one man crossing a line. It was a whole system creating the kind of world where that line could even be approached. Ivanov now had what he needed: a laboratory, official backing, a woman willing to go through with it. The experiment was closer than ever, and then reality stepped in again. The chimpanzees he had brought from Africa started dying, one after another. By the time the woman was ready, the last adult male capable of providing sperm was dead. Everything was in place, except the one thing the experiment depended on. He had come closer than ever, and still failed. By 1929, Ivanov was still trying to continue. He ordered more chimpanzees. He pushed for more time. But the political winds had changed. The Soviet state that once supported him no longer needed him. And men who are useful to power are often discarded the moment they become inconvenient. Ivanov was arrested. Officially, it had nothing to do with his experiments. He was accused of sabotage and anti-state activity, the usual language of a regime turning on one of its own. In reality, he had become a liability. He had produced no success, no miracle, no triumph of Soviet science, just scandal. He was exiled to Kazakhstan. And there, far from the laboratories, the chimpanzees, and the fantasies that had driven him, he died. A man who tried to force nature open with his own hands, ended forgotten on the edge of the empire that once funded him. Ivanov failed, but failure didn't kill the idea. It survived him. Because once a line like that appears in the human imagination, someone always wants to cross it again. Decades later, similar stories surfaced in China. There were claims of experiments involving chimpanzees and human reproductive material. One report described a chimpanzee that had allegedly become pregnant before political violence destroyed the lab and killed the animal. In the United States, there were whispers too. Stories that never became official history. Rumors of a hybrid born and killed almost immediately. No solid proof. No surviving records. Just stories that refused to die. And whether every one of those stories is true or not, the important part is this. People kept trying. Different countries, different systems, same obsession, same question. Can it be done? This wasn't just sick curiosity. Not entirely. There was always a purpose attached to it. A reason. A justification. That's how people make monstrous things feel acceptable. Some imagined a biological breakthrough. Others imagined labor, control, a stronger worker, a more obedient body, something part human, but not fully human. Strong enough to use, different enough to deny dignity. That's the real darkness in stories like this. Not just that someone wanted to create a hybrid. but what kind of world they imagined for it after it was born. They weren't dreaming about a new form of life. They were dreaming about ownership, utility, a living thing designed to serve. That tells you this was never really about discovery. It was about power. And this is where the story stops feeling like old horror and starts feeling current, because we like to think we left this mindset behind. We didn't. We changed the language. That's all. Today, scientists work on chimeras, human cells introduced into animal embryos, research aimed at growing organs for transplantation. And unlike Ivanov's time, this happens inside modern laboratories with institutional approval, ethical reviews, and polished public language. It sounds cleaner, smarter, safer, and in many ways, it is. But the old question never disappeared. Where is the line? At what point does medical progress become something else? At what point does technical ability start moving faster than moral restraint? Ivanov was crude, brutal, unprotected by modern language. But the belief underneath him, that life can be pushed, edited, merged, and redesigned if the goal is big enough, that belief survived. That's what makes this story dangerous. Not just what Ivanov tried to do, but how easy it is to dismiss him as a monster from another era, because that lets us feel safe, different, better. But the truth is more uncomfortable than that. He had worse tools. That doesn't automatically mean we have better instincts. So maybe the real question isn't whether his experiment failed. Maybe the real question is this: if the science became clean enough, safe enough, respected enough, how far would we go now? And would we even recognize the line before we crossed it?